this morning. So ITU is a big picture. So who is ITU? ITU is the International Telecommunication Union. It's the United Nations Specialized Agency for ICTs, and it consists of 3 bureaus. So the Development Bureaus, Standardization Bureaus, and Radio Communication Bureaus. Here, for the Quiet Skies, we will concentrate on the Radio Communication Bureaus and the ITUR sector, and knowing that within those sectors is the member states, the sector members, and the associates that are doing the work at ITU. So there's 193 member states, more than 800 sector members, and more than 100 associate members. So everybody somehow within the delegation or independently can contribute to the work of the ITU. That's why it's first reason why it's part of the solution. The legal framework, so it's important, the legal framework at ITU, because there's 3 types of treaties. So there's the Constitution and the Convention treaty, which are defining the mission, the goals of the ITU. And in addition to that, there's the radio regulations, which is an evolving administrative treaty. It's very particular. It's rare in the treaty international framework. Today, it is more than 2,000 pages of regulations. It's 4 books. And it's the result of the evolution through 39 conferences, treaty conferences since 1906. It's also 40 radio services regulated. It includes terrestrial, maritime, space, and radio astronomy services. So it's regulated basically 2 limited natural resources, the radio spectrum, so from 8.3 kilohertz to 3,000 gigahertz. And on that part, you can see in Slack, there's an interesting discussion with Federico about the light, and if light could be, optical use can be regulated by the radio regulations. In fact, today, it can be regulated, not regulated, but studied if it has impact on the transmissions and emissions and transmissions with satellites. The other limited natural resources is the orbits, so the GSO orbit, which is now we know somehow easy to regulate, and also the non-GSO orbits. So non-GSO orbit, it's not only the LEO, MEO orbits, but it's also the orbits for the other celestial bodies like the Moon, Mars, and deep space probes operations. Now I want to clarify for everybody, that's one of my main messages for this presentation, that there's 2 activities related to the radio regulations. So the first activity, let's call it applying the rules. So if the goal is to obtain the right to use spectrum from an orbital position free from harmful interference. That's the goal. And it is, in practice, the registration of a satellite network or a radio astronomy station within the Master International Frequency Register. So it's done through compatibility analysis and the process related to coordination in between satellite network, and it's done, the calculation and registration by the Radio Communication Bureau, so where I am from. The other activity is what I would call deciding the rules, so having the rules evolving. The goal is to have an efficient and equitable regulations. So, and this need to evolve because the technologies and the use of the spectrum and the orbits is evolving. So it's done through this modification of the radio regulation. And the mechanic to do that is what I would call globally the World Radio Communication Conferences deciding after the mechanics done through the IAUS study groups, which are creating and preparing the technical and regulatory text and text to be amended. So that's a summary. So keeping in mind that there's those two separated activities related to the radio regulation with different actors, because deciding the rules is done by the delegates, applying the rules is done by the Secretariat of the Radio Communication Bureau. So it's completely different people. Now, applying the rule to the recent constellations. Constellations have always been included in the rules. It's not new. So there is some constellation registered before 2015. However, it's in 2015 that the new SpaceX and OneWeb mainly at that time came to ITU saying that they they're creating new type of constellation with many more objects, and they needed new rules and new orbit allocation. And then, since then, there's studies and there's evolution and there's several conferences, and it's an ongoing adaptation of the rules to adapt to this new technology while protecting existing services. So in 2015, 2019, the next month, 2023, and probably 2027, the next conference. Here, I will not go in details, but I wanted to show you that the non-GSO, so the constellation, have to fulfill limitation. They have to fulfill coordination to protect the other non-GSO, the GSO existing, the terrestrial services, and there's a list of provisions with some power limits and restriction for those constellations. And I will not go in details, it has been done before. This is new, and this is interesting because you may hear about the milestone and deployment rules. And this is typically to avoid warehousing the spectrum on the orbits without using, as a filing, but without using it. So that is a famous new milestones, and there's a deployment limits. So there's a traditional 7 years to deploy the first satellites, at least the first satellite. It doesn't mean that it has to be only one satellite within 7 years. It's at least one satellite. And then there's 3 limits after 2 years, 5 years, and 7 years. And 100% of the constellation has to be deployed after 7 years. This is good to keep in mind. It's not because you see regularly new filing received by ITU that all the satellites within the filing will be deployed or can be deployed. That's to be considered if the viability of the new filing is credible or not. So the elaborated evolution of the radio regulations, it goes through this schema. So I put this schema, and I propose you to come back to check this schema whenever you are a bit lost within this mechanism at ITU, because there's everything. There's everything, and that's why I say also you are part of the solution. There's everything, it's elaborated, it's not that simple, it's lengthy, but if you go in details, if you read really the text, there's always a solution. There's always a margin or maneuver to find a solution. There's always a resolution, and a handbook, a recommendation, going to one study group, another study group. There's always a way to go forward. It's not easy, it's not simple, but it exists. The difficulty is, as Pierrot said in his introduction on Monday, it's more on having common understanding and being patient to get consensus. But once the consensus is obtained, when it's in the rules, in the book, it's powerful.
3 minutes. 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So the role of the ITUR radio communication sector is to make this activity and these studies alive. So there's 2 important. the study group 4, the 7 study groups, and the study group 4 is the one dedicated to space services, so they will deal with the rules related to the constellations. And the working party 7D is completely dedicated to radio astronomy, so that's where our friends raising hands are from. About constellations, what will be the question for this coming next month's WRC, which is closing a 4-year study cycle. It will be in Dubai, starting on November, and 4 weeks later, finishing 15 December with decisions and the start of a new study cycle. So about constellation, it will be how to protect existing service and avoid rehousing. It remains a big question, and rules are around this big question, solving these big questions. So bringing to use conditions will be reviewed, and how modification parameters how parameters can be modified to keep the filing alive, not to have a suppression of the filing. That's the main discussion for the constellations. For radio astronomy, there's the ongoing protection of passive frequency bands. There's new agenda possible for the coming 2 next conference. And there's also possibility of adoption of recommendation and resolution. And I will let Federico speaking tomorrow about more in detail about those concrete proposals. And this last slide somehow is for me the most important slide of my presentation, because as I hear in the corridor this week, I see on Slack the questions. I'm here to assist you. To help you to understand how you can find a solution through ITU. So please contact me, don't hesitate. Me and my colleagues at ITU, we are really, really always pleased to help and assist. It's really part of our work. So email, Slack, whatever, I'm here for that. So thank you.
Rudi Albrecht from the Austrian Space Forum. Elon Musk launched his first batch of satellites in 2019, so he must have applied for allocation of frequencies 2 years, 3 years earlier. Now, ITU has an observer position in Corpus. Why did ITU not report to Corpus that there is a satellite provider company about to launch thousands of satellites? I know why the Americans never told us, but I don't quite understand why the ITU never told us.
Good question. Good question, and it leads also to the discussion we will have tomorrow, the relationship in between the ITUR and the COPUOS, so the delegate members of the ITUR and the delegate members of the COPUOS. And up to now, up to this constellation story, it was a clear separation of the mandate, of the work, so they could live and work independently. Honestly, I think, that's a good question, it didn't happen, but I think at that time, nobody thought it would be that impactful and necessary to create this liaison in between those 2 groups of delegates. And, but I think that we learned the lessons, and now we here at COPUOS, maybe less in ITUR, that there's a need of communication in between the 2 committees.
Quick question. In the mandate of the ITU, there is the mention of protection the satellite orbits, right? But can you explain if that extends or not to the physical location of satellites within the mandate of the ITU?
Yeah, that's a discussion we had also this week. Up to now, up to those constellations, we were doing the shortcut at ITU, saying that we were regulating and managing spectrum and orbit. We are not really managing orbit as such, because we have a table of frequency allocation. We don't have a table of orbit allocation or orbit shell allocation. So we regulate and manage the use of the spectrum from an orbital position. And we had that discussion in Slack, so, I would like to precise that you don't own ITU doesn't give you the ownership of a location in space. ITU gives you the right to use a location in space to transmit free from interference. So if you stop transmitting and using that filing, you stop the right to use this orbital position. And secondly, if another satellite network wants to operate at the same orbital position, and there's compatibility in terms of radio regulations in between the two networks, the existing one and the new one, nothing prohibits from having the two at the same location. So especially when we speak about space plans, because space plan is a priori satellite networks, people think that space plan are allocating, are giving orbital position to one country, which is not the case. No, it's similar. They are allocating the right to use an orbital position for a future satellite network to be brought into use.
Unfortunately, we don't have time for more questions, so let's thank Veronique again.